What's up guys, I'm Brad from Fix This Build That, and today I'm going to show you how to make a shoe storage bench. It's a great project to wrangle all those shoes that you got laying around the house. Let's check it out and see how we did it.
The sides of the bench have a modified frame and panel construction. I started by cutting the legs to size from 2x2 material. The bench is going to have a 1/4-inch plywood back also, so I laid out a recess or a rabbet into the back legs to hold the ply. I made one cut to define the depth of the rabbet, and then I raised the blade to match the leftover material and cleared out the rest of it with another cut. You can see I went a little deeper than I needed to on that first cut, but it won't affect the function. The legs are joined by a pair of side rails. I started by cutting 1x4s to length, then I ripped them down to get 2 rails out of each piece that'll be 1x2. After that, I drilled pocket holes in the ends of all the rails. Before joining the rails and the legs together, I cut the side panels to size from 3/4-inch plywood. I laid the legs and the rails face down, and then I secured the top rail with screws. Then I used the panels that I had just cut to position the lower rail. This eliminates any room for error in measuring and gives that exact match. I secured the lower rails and then I moved on to the panels. I drilled pocket holes in the sides to join the legs and one on the top of the panel to attach the walnut seat later. Since 3/4-inch plywood isn't really 3/4 of an inch, I used some playing cards to shim the panels up and make them flush with the inside face of the legs. Then I locked everything in place with some more pocket screws. The base of the bench will be painted, and for a smooth surface I wanted to fill the pocket holes. My intent here was to show you this cool little jig that I made to cut my own plugs from dowels. But as it turns out, installing these plugs was a huge pain in my neck, since I couldn't find a great way to push these in. I reverted to using a scratch-awl to push the plugs in. Bad idea. Yep, that was me just taking a scratch-awl right in the finger. I got lucky there and I only escaped with just a small cut. After pushing a few more of these in by hand, I had an epiphany. If I didn't cut the angle, I could just tap the dowels in with a hammer. This works so much better. I'll never be cutting these angled plugs again and doing stupid things with a scratch-awl. After the glue dried, I came back and I cut the plugs flush, and then I block planed and sanded everything smooth. I also put a small chamfer on the bottom of the legs to help prevent chipping when the bench is being slid. Now the whole reason I'm using 3/4-inch panels versus a floating 1/4-inch panel is so I could mount adjustable shelf pins. I used the shelf pin jig and I drilled the holes on both sides, and then I sanded the whole side assemblies to 150 grit. Next up, I cut the parts for the lower and adjustable shelves from 3/4-inch plywood. Each shelf will receive a piece of trim on the front to hide the plywood edge and give it a beefier look. I used a 1x4 again to get the trim. I cut it to size on the miter saw, and then I took it back to the table saw. I ran the board through to get 2 1x2 trim pieces. Then I used the trim to measure the cross cut on the lower shelf. This gave me an exact match, and I'll do the same for the adjustable shelf later. I drilled pocket holes along the front of the lower shelf to attach the trim and along the sides to attach the side assemblies. The plywood I was using for the shelf was a little warped from sitting in the shop for a while, so I clamped it down firmly to the work surface, and then I attached the trim with pocket screws. The last piece I needed was a back stretcher, and I cut that from the plywood as well, since it's going to be hidden and you won't see it. To attach the top, I drilled 3 large counterbore holes with a Forstner bit in the underside of the front and the back stretchers. I stopped 3/4 of an inch from the other side, and then I came back with a twist bit and drilled a hole all the way through the stretcher. I oversized these through holes to give the screws room for wood movement later. I didn't have a 4-foot clamp, so I used a makeshift clamping strip with some F-clamps to pull the sides together. I attached the front and the back stretchers, then flipped the base over and attached the lower shelf. I used spring clamps to position the shelf, and then I referenced the distance between the bottom of the shelf and the bottom of the legs to make sure everything was even around the bench. With everything in the right position, I attached the shelf with pocket screws. With the base assembled, I cut the plywood for the adjustable shelf to width, factoring in the shelf pins. I cut a 1x4 to that same length, and then I ripped it down on the table saw to the 1x2 size for the trim. I attached the trim the same way I did before, and then I gave the shelf a little test fit. To trim out the side panels, I used cove molding. I mitered it to fit around the inside of the panel, and then I tacked it in place with a pin nailer. Next, I cut a back panel from 1/4-inch plywood, and I was ready for paint. I sanded everything to 150 grit, and then I put my first of 3 coats of semi-gloss latex paint on. The final 2 coats were done with a foam roller versus the nap roller you see here. It gives a much smoother finish. Now it's my favorite part, the walnut top. I picked out this huge 12-foot long board from my walnut stash, and I started by breaking it down on the miter saw. I cut it into 3 4-foot sections, which was great because it was exactly what I needed. I cleaned the boards up a little bit. They had a lot of dirt and bark on them, so I wanted to make sure it was a little bit easier on my joiner and planer knives. Each board had a little bit of a cup to it as well, so I started by face joining the boards, making sure I had one smooth and flat side. From there, I went over to the planer and I flattened the other sides of the boards until all the boards had the rough milling marks gone and had smooth surfaces on both sides. If you don't have a joiner or a planer, you can purchase hardwood boards already milled on all 4 sides at a number of different places online, as well as local hardwood dealers. With the boards flattened smooth on the faces, I went back to the joiner and I milled a flat edge on each board. And I finished off by taking the boards to the table saw and ripping them all to the width that I needed. I ended up having to leave some sapwood on the boards, but I really liked the character that it gives it. To join the boards together, I used wood glue and a bevy of clamps. No biscuits, dominoes, or other oddly named joinery methods are needed here. I just put a few small clamps on the glue joints at the ends of the boards, and that helps keep everything aligned.
There are a few bug holes in this, and I'm going to fill those with epoxy. I'm just going to mix it up. It's just some cheap stuff I've got from Harbor Freight, but it's worked well in other projects. I hope I have enough. Let's see how it goes.
I mixed the 2-part epoxy together, and then I used a popsicle stick to fill it into the holes. I ended up having just enough to cover all the repairs, so it was perfect. When the epoxy was dry, I came back with a card scraper and went over the repairs just to get everything down to a smooth surface before final surfacing. From here you could go straight to an orbital sander, but since I have a drum sander, I used it for the final flattening. This thing saves a ton of time. Next I took the top over to the table saw, and I cut it down to its final size on the crosscut sled. The top was pretty thick at 1 1/8 inches, and the front edge had some voids left over from the bark removal. So I decided to put a bevel on the underside of the top, because this is going to help lighten the look, and it's also going to help me deal with those bark voids all in one step. I set the saw blade to 45 degrees, and then I adjusted the fence so that the blade lined up with my layout lines. I cut the front edge this way, and then I turned the board and cut the side bevels after removing the fence. Using a chamfer bit in my router would have been a much easier task here, but my bit just wasn't big enough to give the size bevel that I needed. Cutting the sides was a little unwieldy, and it left some burning on the bevel during the cut. I used a block plane and a card scraper to remove any of the burning from the cut and to smooth everything out. I finished up by sanding the whole top to 220 grit, and I was ready for finish. I used a satin polyurethane finish for some extra protection and some durability on this one. I applied 2 coats that were thin 25%, and then 2 more coats that were thin 50-50 with mineral spirits. I really love how this top came out. It's just a nice warm feel to it, and I always love walnut. After the top was dry, I put it on the base and positioned it for consistent reveal around the front and the sides. I clamped it down with some quick clamps, and then I secured it to the base through the oversized holes that I drilled earlier in the stretchers. This is going to allow for that seasonal movement that I talked about as the wood on the walnut top expands and contracts. I flipped the bench around and then I nailed on the back with a brad nailer. The last thing I did was install the adjustable shelf. I used those shelf pins that have a hole in them, and this is so I can secure that shelf in there with some screws, because it's going to see a lot of action of shoes going in and out. So here's what was going on in our entryway that brought on this project. I love this heart pine bench that I made, but it does nothing for our organization. But now, oh yeah, my wife and I really love this project. So organized.
If you want to build your own shoe storage bench, there's a link down below in the description. That'll take you to my website. There's full plans available there, as well as all the materials that I used to make the project. So go check it out. If you're not subscribed, I'd love to have you as part of the channel. Comment down below and let me know what you think about the video. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.